As part of our year-long series reading a book together as a congregation, Sarah Hurwitz's book, Here All Along, every month I'm going to devote one D'var Torah to one of the chapters in the book to help us deepen our understanding and learning about what Sarah Hurwitz is teaching us. Last month on Simchat Torah at dinner, I talked about chapter 1. That was our kickoff of reading the book. And tonight I'm going to talk about chapter 2. And just a little advertisement that if you have not started reading your book or don't have a copy of the book, we still have books. Becky can give you a book. If you're not in a book group and want to be in a book group, let Becky know. She'll put you in a book group. If you have those things and want extra bookmarks, we have a lot of extra bookmarks. Take them for your other books. Happy to share those with you. They were designed by our very talented Marco Siegel Acevedo, and they're worth having several at home, and we made quite a few of them. So what's chapter 2 about? The process of Judaism, questioning, debating, and interpreting. One doesn't need to spend much time in a Jewish community before you hear the quip, 2 Jews, 3 opinions. We've heard it, and we've said it probably ourselves as well. Argument, disagreement, expressing differences of opinion, these are a feature of Judaism, as we say, not a bug. There's a well-known story from the Talmud that illustrates the importance of multiple opinions within our tradition. In this Talmudic story, the rabbis were arguing, surprise, surprise, over whether or not a particular oven was kosher or not. Rabbi Eliezer argues that the oven is ritually pure, while the other rabbis argue that the oven is impure. When none of Rabbi Eliezer's arguments convince his colleagues, he cries out, if the halakha, if the Jewish law is in accordance with my opinion, this carob tree will prove it. At this point, the carob tree that he was pointing to leaps from the ground and moves far away. The other rabbis look, and they say, the movement of a carob tree offers no proof in a debate over law, they say to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer begins to get frustrated, and he cries out, if Jewish law is in accordance with my opinion, the stream here will prove it. As the rabbis look, the stream begins to flow backwards. But again, the rabbis point out that one does not cite a stream as proof in matters of law. Really frustrated at this point, Rabbi Eliezer cries out, if the halakha, if the Jewish law is in accordance with my opinion, the walls of this study hall where we are right now, they will prove it. And all of a sudden, the rabbis were sitting there, and the walls of the study hall began to fall. But then they were scolded by Rabbi Joshua, who reprimanded the walls for interfering in debate among scholars. Out of respect for Rabbi Joshua, they did not continue to fall. But out of respect for Rabbi Eliezer, they did not go back to their original place. They remained at a slant. Now, in great frustration, Rabbi Eliezer cries out finally, if the Jewish law is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. All of a sudden, a booming voice came from heaven saying, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as Jewish law is always in accordance with his opinion in almost every matter? God spoke to the rabbis, proving that Rabbi Eliezer was right. But you know what happened? Rabbi Joshua said, sorry, God, lo b'shamayim, the Torah is not in heaven, as you taught us in the book of Deuteronomy. Torah is right here in the study hall. And at the end of the story, God turns to the rabbis and he says, nitzchuni banai, you've bested me, you rabbis. You're right. The Torah is not in heaven. Miracles don't teach us about Jewish law. God can't even come down and tell you what the law is. It now is in your hands. Once Torah is given to human beings, you have to wrestle with it. And that is what we have done for thousands of years. Yes, as Jews, we have an interpretive tradition, We don't just take the text as it is, but we struggle with it, and we look for deeper meanings in it, and we argue with each other about it. As the great 20th century Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, Judaism is based upon a minimum of revelation and a maximum of interpretation. A minimum of revelation, maximum of interpretation. Imagine for a moment that Judaism is a tree. The Torah are the roots of the tree. The Mishnah, the Talmud, the collection of rabbinic commentaries, the codes literature, Parshanut, Responsa, all of those interpretations that come after Torah, they are the trunk. So we have Torah, and we have all that interpretive literature that's now the trunk. And then the branches are the different streams of Judaism. There's the Reform branch and the Conservative branch and the Orthodox branch and many more branches now that are filling out. And if you think about it, if you think and you look at a tree, you know that the trunk is larger and more voluminous than the roots are. And if you were to go into our Beit Midrash, into our study hall that's right next to us here, and you were to look on the shelf, you'd see that there is an entire shelf of Talmud interpretations of the text, and there would be one of the Torah about this big. We have much more interpretation than we have of the original text. And we all interpret. It doesn't matter if we're Orthodox or Conservative or Reform or Reconstructionist or non-denominational or Hasidic. You know what? We all interpret. Don't let anyone ever tell you that the Orthodox are a literalist tradition. It is not true. They interpret. They're the ones who wrote that Talmud and follow it still to this day. There's no such thing as a literalist strand in tradition. Last month, I spoke about the fact that right from the beginning of Torah, we can't claim a literalist tradition. In the first story in the Torah, we have the creation in 7 days, and in the second chapter, we have a different story of creation, the Garden of Eden. Right away from the beginning of Torah, we have to interpret because we're thrown two stories about how the world is created, and we have to figure out how to square that. And the rabbis, of course, have a field day finding lots of meanings. That the first story of creation teaches us that we have to subdue the earth, and the second story that we need to till and tend the garden, that we're supposed to do good and not harm, among many other interpretations. When I try to teach people about the differences among the various denominations, I illustrate it with my hands, and I say, if this hand represents tradition, Torah and Talmud, all of that interpretive tradition, and this hand represents modernity, what we're going through in our lives today, this is how I would say the different denominations represent themselves. That in Orthodoxy, the hand of what is happening in our lives, the current situations, speaks a little more quietly, and the tradition speaks loudly. And they talk to each other, and the rabbis continue to interpret, but this strand is a little bit quieter than the voice of tradition. For the conservative movement, I would say that this hand is a little bit louder. So the voice of tradition is still a little bit louder than the voice of modernity and the current context in which we live, but they're talking to each other. And instead of thinking, as some do, that in the Reform movement we shut down the voice of tradition, I said, no, the voice of tradition is still equally loud, but we think that the voice of modernity is equal to that, and they're in equal dialogue with each other. That for me, that's the best way of understanding the differences among the various denominations. So the question for us is, how do we know what's the right interpretation? If there's so many different interpretations and so many ways of looking in Torah, what's right and what's wrong? Well, the answer to that, folks, is we don't know. It's part of the beauty and the difficulty of Judaism, is we don't always know if we've gotten it right. In fact, we almost never know if we've gotten it right. And part of what Sarah Hurwitz talks about in this chapter is it should give us a great deal of humility. That we could get it wrong, which means we have to be open to other ideas, because with other ideas, perhaps we'll move closer to the truth. And there are two different kinds of interpretations that we have within our tradition, because there are two different parts of Torah. We have within the Torah what we call the stories, or in Hebrew we call it the Agadah. Sounds like Haggadah from Passover, same word. And we also have in Torah halakha, the law. The book of Genesis, primarily a book of Agadah, teaching us about our ancestors, and it's a book of stories. And in other parts of the Torah, particularly Leviticus and Deuteronomy, we have a lot of halakha, Jewish law. And there's a difference in how we interpret, whether it's interpreting a story or interpreting a law. Let me give you an example of an interpretation of Agadah. In this week's Torah, we read that Abraham dies. But before he dies, we learn that he was blessed in his life, bakol, with everything. It's a beautiful sentiment that Abraham's going to die, he's been blessed, bakol. What does it mean he was blessed with everything? We can interpret that in a myriad of ways, and each of us might have a different way of understanding what would it mean to be fully and completely blessed in our lives. And however we interpret that, in many ways, that would be correct. Because this is a story, and interpretation needs to speak to our heart and influence how we're moved internally. But it's not about how we're going to act in the world in terms of Jewish law. There's a particular interpretation that I learned about this Torah portion 15 years ago, and I remember it was 15 years ago because 15 years ago, Ivy, is when we celebrated my son's Kabbalat mitzvah. 15 years ago, Yonah stood on this bima, and we celebrated with him, and when Danny, my husband, and I blessed him, we learned this interpretation of bakol, that the word bakol has the same numeric equivalent as the word ben, as son. So we said to be blessed, bakol, with everything, is to be blessed with you as our son. Now for me, that's incredibly meaningful. It might not be for you, and that's okay. We can have different interpretations, but for us in that moment, bakol. On the other hand, when we interpret Jewish law, we have to think about it a little bit differently because it's going to affect our behavior. It says several different times in Torah that we shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. And we've interpreted this to mean that we shouldn't eat milk and meat together, including, as the rabbi said, we shouldn't have chicken and milk together. Do you know how many people ask me that question, Rabbi, why can't we eat chicken and milk? It's not meat. You can't have, that's not the mother here. That's not at all possible. I say, you're right. It's not. It should just be, if we were to go literally by what it says here in the text, it would be this particular cow and this particular cow's milk, right? But that's not what the rabbis did with it. They expanded that interpretation. Now, I could decide in my life, that doesn't make any sense, and I want to interpret it differently, and I'm going to have my chicken in cream sauce. I can do that, but then I'm not according to halakha, according to Jewish law anymore. There's a history, and there's a tradition, and there are groups of people who decide, and we accept their interpretations if we want to be part of that particular group. Now, as Reformed Jews, we know we get some choice in that, so we're also a little bit different there. But I can't just decide I'm going to change the law. I can decide I'm not going to uphold the law, but I can't change it. The rabbis, however, do adapt laws through a process of interpretation. Sarah Hurwitz in this chapter gives an example of one of these ways in which the rabbis adapt Jewish law. She shares the story of the rebellious son. The rebellious son, according to Torah, should be taken out to the town square and stoned to death. If this had been implemented, very few people would make it out of adolescence. And so the rabbis realized they better do something with this particular text. If we were going to interpret Torah literally, this would be very dangerous. And so they created a very narrow application of the law. They said, yes, we should stone somebody, but only under these conditions. It could only be applied during a 3-month period at a certain stage of a boy's development. Only to a boy who ate a certain kind of meat and drank a certain kind of wine. And only a boy whose parents were identical to each other in voice, appearance, and height. If that's all those circumstances are met, all those conditions, you can go stone him. what's the likelihood? And this is done with other laws as well. It's done with capital punishment. Torah says a life for a life. If you take a life, you should be killed. But they realized the danger in that, and so they created these stipulations. A life can be taken only if a person had been warned as they were about to perpetrate the act, and only if 2 witnesses saw a person killing another person, and the testimony of those 2 witnesses exactly corroborated with each other. Well, when does that happen when a murder takes place? And so therefore you narrow the law. You don't get rid of it, but you narrow it so the application is very limited. And if you think about most of the book of Leviticus talks about animal sacrifice. When's the last time you went to a synagogue and saw an animal being sacrificed? Good, I'm glad to hear that's not happening anywhere. That's the right answer. But I do get asked by people who are not Jewish, do you still sacrifice animals, Rabbi? Can we come to see the sacrifices? So, no, we haven't sacrificed animals in 2,000 years since the Second Temple was destroyed in the year 70. And you might think to yourself, well, how is that possible? There's an entire book dedicated to this is the way we pray, and yet this is not the way we pray anymore. Well, rabbis decided in the 1st and 2nd century that instead of animal sacrifice, we would have prayer. We would offer the words of our heart and not animals. What gives? How did the rabbis get around the fact that we're told we're supposed to sacrifice animals to worship God? So what they said is, well, it's only temporary. We're going to use the words of prayer now, and someday, when there's a 3rd temple that's built in Jerusalem, we'll go back to sacrificing animals. That someday, fortunately, still has not come. They narrowed the law. How can they do this? Rabbi Daniel Hartman, who is the president of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, which is an interdenominational place of learning, teaches this. The anthropocentric nature of revelation, its intended audience is human beings, requires that it be bounded in a particular place and time and speak the language of the human beings of that culture and era with all their moral and psychological imperfections. Revelation thus cannot be viewed as pure expression of God's will, but rather as an expression of God's will filtered through the mindset and mores of its intended audience, end quote. To which Sarah Hurwitz adds, with their debates in the Talmud, the rabbis ensured that the core truths of revelation would not be forever trapped in the specifics of ancient laws developed for an ancient people. That the reason that Judaism is still alive today is because we've continued to interpret and make it relevant. That if we were just to observe it the way we find in Torah, it would no longer be relevant to our lives because people lived very differently at that time. So again, we go back to this question, how do we know which is the right interpretation? A few weeks ago, Rabbi Dr. Wendy Zerler was here teaching us, and she gave us a powerful answer to this question about how do we know which interpretation is right. She asked this question, how do we find truth? And she shared with us that there are 2 major schools of thought during the Talmudic period. Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai, and Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel. And there were many disputes between those 2 schools of thought within the Talmud, and the Talmud declares that both of them had legitimate things to teach. The Talmud says, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim, both opinions of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai are the voice of the living God. So how do we know which is right? The Talmud then goes on to say, the law is usually according to Beit Hillel. Why? Because Beit Hillel will put the opinions of Beit Shammai first when they were in a debate, and they would treat them kindly and with respect. And Rabbi Zerler taught us that love, caring, and humility, these are essential to getting to truth. That without them, we're not going to know what is right. And I offer this teaching, a favorite teaching of mine that was from my rabbinic thesis, which I wrote on the Midrash on the interpretations of the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is a nice novella that we read on Shavuot, And the Midrash asks, why do we read it on Shavuot? On Shavuot, we celebrate the giving of the Torah, and the book of Ruth has nothing to do with Jewish law, so that doesn't make sense. We're celebrating the giving of Torah, of law, and yet we read this book as a companion. The Midrash says that there are no laws about purity or impurity in the book of Ruth, nothing that has to do with how we live according to the halakha, according to the Jewish law. So why the book of Ruth? It teaches us about the value of gimilut chasadim, of loving kindness. And we read that when we celebrate the revelation of Torah, to say that we can only interpret Torah through the lens of loving kindness if we're really going to get to truth. So how do we bring that lens to our text? I know that some people are intimidated by Torah study, thinking that it's for the rabbis or others. But what Sarah Hurwitz teaches us and what Jewish tradition reminds us is know that Torah is for all of us. Lo b'shamayim hi, but it's not in the heavens. And sometimes people say, well, I don't know, I don't understand it, or I look at it and it doesn't make any sense to me and I don't learn anything from it. The blessing that we say when we study Torah is this: la'asok b'divrei Torah. That when we look at the text of Torah, we're supposed to be occupying ourselves with Torah, la'asok, to busy ourselves. It doesn't say we're supposed to be learning Torah. And for me, that's been particularly meaningful, because what our tradition is saying to us is that time spent with the text, especially in the community of others, without expectation of what you're going to find, that's when we find nuggets of wisdom and grow and learn and deepen relationships with others. For the study of Torah is not done in silence, not done alone. It's done in a noisy, boisterous Beit Midrash. If you've ever been in one, you sit over a text of Talmud together and you can hardly hear yourself think because there's so much noise in the space because people are debating and challenging and growing together. Rachel Naomi Remen, who's a doctor and not a rabbi, but always has most wisdom to say, she teaches this: perhaps the secret to living well is not in having all the answers, but in pursuing unanswerable questions in good company. For me, that's the beauty and the magic and the wisdom of Torah study. I hope we can continue to learn and grow in Torah together and learn through Sarah Hurwitz's wonderful book. We rise together now on page